Hi, everybody. This is Mike Oppenheim, and you are listening to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. This week, we have a cultural anthropologist, James F. Richardson. He also has a PhD in cultural anthropology, and he studied American society for 20 years as a market research consultant. He recently authored a new nonfiction book, Our Worst Strength, questioning our approach to individualism as a way of life. He lives in Tucson, Arizona, and as you know, I am here in Phoenix, Arizona, and he writes a weekly Substack, Homo Imaginari, and we'll hear more about that, and it will also be in the notes section. So thank you, James, for showing up and being on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, we always ask every guest at the beginning, how old are you, where did you grow up, and what generation, if any, do you consider yourself a member of?
I'm 52, and I grew up in southern New Hampshire, and I'm Generation X.
Awesome. I love New Hampshire. Do they still have the live free or die license plate?
Yes.
That's cool. What brought you to Tucson?
We moved our family down here to reduce our cost of living and get access to a better climate than Seattle.
That's cool. That makes sense. I love Seattle too. I used to live up in Portland. So I love your bio, and I know I read it at the beginning to our audience, but my brother studied anthropology, and he got an MA or an MS in it, and then that was as far as he went. But I love cultural anthropology. So let's kind of start with that. Were you driven as a child? Did you go straight into college and start studying that, or was there something that brought you into it?
I did study it in college, and then I went straight into a grad program, so I got kind of obsessed, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And what was the obsession over?
I just, originally I think I was fascinated by all the theoretical discussions, but to be honest, I think it was really being able to immerse myself in very, very different cultural worlds that allowed me, in a sense, to escape from New England.
That's cool.
I think that was the initial pull.
Do you have any strong influences? Are you a Victor Turner fan or anything like that?
Well, I was in college. Yeah, no, he was a big one. And I think, and actually the theme of ritual is germane to this discussion today.
Mm-hmm.
The ritualization of death and how it does or does not function. But the topic that fascinated me the most, I think, originally was actually religion, because I'm not religious.
Mm-hmm.
And I was one of those who was dragged to church as sort of a moral act. But I became fascinated by other religious belief systems and what made them compelling to people. And that, I think it actually took me until middle age to figure out. Actually, my PhD in anthropology wasn't as helpful at figuring out why you might be attracted. Be attracted to symbolic systems that essentially erase you as an individual. And they place you in a cosmic context in which you basically don't matter.
Yeah. I completely agree.
So to an upper middle class sort of ego-fed, overachieving young person, this is just not a relevant issue. It's not a desire to have yourself disappear.
Yeah. I'm sure you're familiar with Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, and one of the things he said was you spend the first half of your life becoming somebody just to realize you want to become nobody.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's really bad though in the U.S. right now.
Yeah.
So I think it's gotten to a point of just total cuckoo.
Go a little deeper into that, because I think I agree, but I want to hear the specific. You think that we're becoming too much about becoming somebody? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think I'll share an anecdote that's, I think, evocative of this broader social change, which kind of inspired my recent book. We had, for a while, when we had a bigger income than now, my wife and I, and the kids were younger, my wife and I had a house cleaning service. And this kid came in one day, and he saw this business book that I've written, and it's called Ramping Your Brand. It has nothing to do with becoming a YouTube star, but I think that's what he thought.
Yeah,
it's a very niche industry book. But anyways, he saw it in my office and offered to buy a copy, and I said, "I'll just give it to you. Don't worry about it." And then he came back a few more weeks, and then he disappeared. And he told me in my yard that he was really wanted to build a personal brand. He wanted to, and I sat there going, but you're cleaning homes. I didn't say this to him. I'm like, you're cleaning houses. How do you get from that to this thing? Why does he think this is possible? Is what I'm asking myself as a researcher in my head. Like, this would be regarded as insanity in a traditional society, right? This would require a shaman to come in and beat you over the head with sage to get the evil demon out. But in his case, it seems entirely plausible. And I think the internet has created this false illusion that like planning to become a celebrity is actually that's like a career.
Yeah.
Like that's just as rational as saying I want to go to law school. So to me, that group, I mean, I know I'm 52, but like to me, to make those equivalent is just, it requires an enormous amount of cultural energy to make those things equivalent in a young person's mind.
Yeah.
When we know the odds of one happening, like law school, unless you're really bad at school, you can make law school happen. Mm-hmm. Now you may not pass the bar exam. That's a separate problem. That's the final lead up. But we can get you through law school somewhere in this country. So that is, I would say the odds of success are better than random. But the idea that you can just plan to become, I don't know, some Instagram star, or that you should start at the age of 21 trying to do that, I just don't get it. And to me, it's the apotheosis, essentially, of a hyper-individualist society in which you're given a lot of autonomy as a young adult to pick from a myriad of options about how to plan your entire life. And that's what my book kicks off at, is that we seem to have forgotten that this is pretty new. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like parents and family giving their kids the freedom to decide their career, who they have sex with, who they marry, how they spend their money, completely independently of the family, is really new.
I think about this all the time because I have 2 young children, and I'm like, what did I set these people up for? Like, I always talk to my friends and I say, first of all, I don't call it capitalism anymore. I call it American capitalism, and I'm very careful how I talk because there's a lot of missing words and context in a lot of conversations where we see a binary between communism and capitalism, which I don't see it as a binary at all. Yeah. So, prefacing that mostly for my audience, not you, but the point is, I don't know how much to prepare my kids even for law school. Like, is even law school a safe bet? Because if the American version of capitalism is tied into, like, paying for a degree, being in debt, or even not being in debt, but, like, professors getting tenure and making that a livable lifetime job, there's just so many nuances in it. And if it breaks, it's going to break bad in my...
So I agree with you. But I think there is a connection to our belief in death and all of this. And this is where listeners have to just run with me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, please. You're on the right show.
Because it doesn't seem like they should have anything to do, like how I choose my career is related to my view of death. This guy's nuts. But unfortunately, this is how society works, right? Because all cultural assumptions, if we have any, they're all in our back of our head at the same time, right? They're interconnected in our brain. They're not. It's not like they come. It's not like a safe deposit box where we go and select them. They're all there. And, I'm looking at my talking points, and this, one of the things that we forget, sociologists have this phrase called the conditions of possibility. And I borrow it and I use it in my book because it's jargony, but it's really good jargon, because it's this notion that in order for people to perceive a certain choice exists in their life, the society has to be set up for that perception to be plausible. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's what I was getting at with the house cleaner who wants to develop a personal brand. He thinks that's possible. And he thinks that's possible because we're a very affluent, consumption-oriented society. And most of that consumption is actually media. It's not even things. And so in societies like ours, people live in the near future. This is why you're always scrolling down the feed. Yeah. You're always trying to scroll down. We're living in the next 5 to 15 minutes, never in the present.
Wow.
And so when you're that future anchored and it's about the next new thing you're consuming, death has to disappear, because death is the end of consumption.
Wow. Right? Yeah.
So I always joke with people about, like, when we updated our family trust and living will and all that stuff that responsible people are supposed to do if you own anything, is I'm like, well, what do I do? What do I do about Amazon Subscribe and Save? Because they're still coming in. Like the packages are inbound on the trucks and I'm dead. But that's literally how we're dying now.
Yeah.
I grew up probably like you in the 80s.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Very sarcastic and anti-authoritarian
Yes.
and whatever. But I used to joke about death. I used to joke about suicide all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not funny.
Mm-hmm.
In a consumer-oriented society, death can't be discussed because it's the end of consumption. And so death is a joke.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah.
It can only be a joke because if you actually acknowledge it, then the whole basis of your current existence is so dilettantishly stupid and irrelevant, right? Versus wiping your grandfather's ass because he's disabled, something meaningful, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which we don't want to do because that's not consumption. That's ugh.
Yeah.
I don't get anything out of that. So, but no, this is how we all are trained to think. We don't all think this way,
No.
but we're trained, we're encouraged to think this way.
Yeah.
And it's there in the back of our heads, so we have to fight it.
Mm-hmm.
And the irony about the silence of our discussion of death is that it actually reflects the value of any one individual human being in a complex industrialized society. We're basically worthless, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
No, seriously, I'm actually worth more to my wife dead. I'm $1 million in her tax-free check. That's what.
Yeah.
So we're worthless because our society has created systems that basically feed all of our needs.
Mm-hmm.
Without having to be dependent on each other, right? So we have groups and families and loved ones where we don't actually provide the basics of life to each other. We get them from third-party bureaucracies using cash. Mm-hmm. And so any one of us is totally replaceable. So as far as like this functioning of society, if you go to a pre-literate tribe, ironically, every individual body is very necessary.
Yeah.
Like they have very important work to do every day. When they die, when that individual dies in those communities, it's like someone gashed everybody's thigh with a knife. Mm-hmm. And that is why they have grief rituals, which to affluent Euro-American white people just seem totally histrionic and like emotionally out of control.
Yeah. Wow.
Right? But that's because they're not reacting. They're not having an academic reaction to death or a death avoidant reaction to death. They're having a normal human reaction to death, which is, oh, we lost labor. We lost something really valuable, right?
Yeah. Versus
what's going on in America, all over the country, in the houses of old people, is that they feel useless because our society has made them useless.
Wow. I mean, this is beyond profound.
So and we know this on at our unconscious level, and I'm talking about the things under our conscious level of awareness that are not comfortable to talk about, so we don't talk about. One of the reasons we can't talk about death and we're death avoidant, it's not just the consumer-oriented society. I think that's a big one. Mm-hmm. Because you don't want to die if you have something coming, if there's something cool every 15 minutes. No, seriously.
No, it sounds so cynical that the part of me that grew up in the 80s is laughing, like the way I would with the Simpsons episode. Hey everyone, if you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's MIKEYOPP.com. Thanks.
Right. So the other reason that this bizarre death avoidance is possible is not just because we have great medical care, blah, 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 and we're rich. It's the consequence of that. It's that death is not happening to us in our social network. In the network of people we care about and interact with, death almost never happens statistically. Mm-hmm. Death doesn't become routine until you basically get into your 70s.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So imagine spending 70 years and before death is a routine occurrence. Mm-hmm. It's not a real phenomena. I have seen more death in film, Mike, than in my life.
Yeah.
When I lived in India for 3 years, I went to like 20 funerals in 3 years. Mm-hmm. Before that, I had been to one funeral in 25 years. Mm-hmm.
I worked in hospice care, so that's the only reason. Well, it's not the only, but a lifetime of questioning what happens after we die led to me helping people as they die in weird circumstances throughout my life. And then I ended up doing hospice care because I knew I was good at it. And then that prompted me to start a podcast for the exact reason you're talking about, which is this country has a serious issue with avoiding death.
Did you find a high percentage of people psychically unprepared for their
Oh,
imminent death?
I mean, almost everyone.
Yeah.
Like almost everyone.
Yeah, and to me, that is a national tragedy.
Yeah, yeah.
It really is. And because we can't solve it, we have to work harder to take the topic seriously. And I hate to say it, it's just like therapy. You got to add it to your list of personal development things because society's not getting you prepared.
Yeah.
Society is basically teaching you to avoid the topic
Mhm.
at all, if at all possible. Please don't, because first of all, it's a downer,
Yeah.
right? So like, I don't want to, I can't sell you anything when you're talking about death. It's horrible.
Yeah.
So I can't get you excited. But I do think people have to get prepared because the stress I hate to say this, the stress that's caused to families when one individual cannot let go of life is unbelievable. This idea that death is some medical thing that just happens to you is nonsense. And everybody who's had a lot of experience with death knows that you can talk yourself right out of life without a weapon. You can psychically let go. Mm-hmm. This is a normal part of the human death process.
Yeah.
But when you have trained people to cling to life
mm-hmm.
so they can get the next subscribe and save, what are they doing to their families, right?
Yeah.
So, we have medicine that props people up on oxygen tanks and 17 drugs. I have an in-law who's in this situation. Lovely person, but she is essentially being propped up. 100 years ago, she would have been dead 20 years before. Mm-hmm. And it would have happened very quickly. Mm-hmm. But instead, we have now a chronically half-dying person that the family has to deal with. Mm-hmm. It's very stressful.
Yeah. And then there's the whole aspect of like, who is keeping her alive and at what cost, and who's going to bear the burden of that cost, and how fake is that cost?
Well, and then the guilt of wishing your loved one is dead. Mm-hmm. Because you can't take it anymore. I'm not saying that's my situation, but that's a situation for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Or how about the guilt of feeling relieved that they're finally dead? Not because you hated them, but because the stress of dealing with their illnesses has just gone on for so long. And I think so. Yeah. It's added to our therapy checklist is we've got to prepare ourselves emotionally for death, and we're horrible at it. I'm not really sure that I'm much better at it, but I do. As I've gotten older, I've started to talk myself into it. I'm just because I'm not very religious. I'm just framing it as a very long nap.
Well, that's actually the critical question we always ask our guests. When you say you're framing it, I get that, but that's still pretty couched. Do you actually have a real like intuitive feeling or strong position on what you think is going to happen when you die?
Oh, I don't. No. Yeah. I'm up for irony, which is that if it's a painful death, it'll just be a painful shutoff, but it will essentially turn into a long nap.
Well, a nap would imply that the person eventually wakes up to know they had a nap. So are you implicating that like at some point you would then have consciousness of the fact that you died?
Oh, I would not be surprised if we live in some kind of eternal dream state weirdness. That would not shock me at all. And we've all seen 12 sci-fi movies to that effect. But that would not surprise me.
Yeah.
And I think I'll be ready for that.
I think that's most likely just based on how sleeping works. And when you are in there, I always try to relate this to people. I have memories of my dreams, but in my dreams, I'm never actually me, Mike Oppenheim. I never look in a mirror and see my face. So for all I know, I'm an interdimensional being, and this is just one dimensional facet of me. And again, I'm saying this, it sounds playful, but it really is just me running consciousness experiences, like how do I know I don't wake up every day and remind myself who I am and where I am?
I don't know that anyone's written... I'm not an avid consumer on the literature of death and dying. I've read some books, but I don't know of anyone who's really looked at whether or not people grieve more quickly and effectively in pre-modern sort of highly communalist, essentially non-cash based societies. There aren't a lot of those communities left. There's some, but I suspect that they do grieve more effective, but I could be wrong. I think there's a lot of dysfunctional grief in this country. I see it all over the podcast verse. There's all these shows on grieving. Like, do you have any idea? Why do we need a show to teach us how to grieve? You know what I'm saying? That should be ritualized basic knowledge in a society.
Yes.
The people get lost in grief for years. And I'm not talking about 16-year-old daughters killed in a car crash, something mega tragic. I'm just, grandma died. And my mother died and I'm grieving for years. I mean, it's just weird. You should be prepping for your parents' death long before it happens.
Yeah. Which is funny because I did and I have been. So as my parents enter their late 70s, I'm doing a lot of stuff that we're talking about. And I'm glad I did it. It doesn't make it easier, but it does make it manageable is the best way I'd explain it to other people. Like the fact that we had conversations when I was in my 20s and they were in their 60s as opposed to waiting till now when I'm in my 40s and they're in their late 70s. As a cultural anthropologist, who and what mechanisms are we supposed to use to revert or change the course of a culture? Like, so our culture is pretty dang embedded in this direction. Like, do you have any sort of like advice as a cultural anthropologist or even just as a person?
That is the unspoken sort of hanging thread in my new book as well. And I refused to when I wrote the book. And it's more of a narrative exploration of how individualism operates in everyday life. It's not meant to be a PR book, which has one point and 12 chapters. To reiterate the one point.
Totally. Yes.
And then you get on CNN and the CBS show and all of it because you only have one idea. It's meant to drown you in a topic, and then you, to some extent, will come to your own conclusions, which is, to me, a better public service. But I think the one thing I could not resolve and refused to resolve during the research was that, essentially, as historians, we know how more conservative societies function. We know how they function. We kind of know the pros and cons, although we're a little judgmental. But we also know that history is very cyclical, right? Mm-hmm. Western historians tend to really downplay that in the way they just frame everything, which I find kind of funny. But like the way we know from the historical record that societies become more communalist is unfortunately through collective tragedy. But that's how it happens. And in the recent past, we can look to the Depression and the World Wars and the Depression were kind of like a triple whammy for the U.S. that allowed an enormous amount of constitutional, congressional, federal, and local level change to happen to fight against what I would call the early alienation of urban industrialism. Because we got a taste of cuckoo individualism in the 20s, in the big cities. Like it was already, we had started to get going. Then we had this massive economic depression. And then we had a massive world war conflagration for 5 years. So those two things came together and they dragged us back to family, dragged us back to communal obligation. Those forces can happen again. They could happen next year. Who knows? So that's generally how it happens. That's just not something you can really plan.
I'm joking, but I'm also serious. It's sort of like the same way if a person takes advantage of a bunch of people and then something really hard hits them and then all of a sudden they see the light and they're just kind to others and they change their ways. You're saying collectively as a culture, World War II can metaphorically slap a culture in the face and create, more community. So unfortunately, we're kind of rooting against ourselves to root for ourselves.
What it does is external forces, most of them negative, cause people to collaborate more in defense. I mean, the problem that we're dancing around is the awkwardness of the fact that most of us want to be highly autonomous beings, and we're ready to go even to court to defend that right? And yet we're not ever really raising our hand until topics like death come up and dealing with a dying relative. Then we have to talk about the uncomfortable thing, which is, well, what is my obligation to family? So, and obligation is just a word. It's a word that, like death. And if you talk to anybody who's grown up in like India or Pakistan or an urbanized developing country and came here for work, they can give you a clear contrast between how they were raised versus what they're seeing here. And most of them came here to get away from something. It may take you months to get that out of them. There's something about the local community or their family that was messed up.
Yeah. I taught ESL for 10 years, so I'm more familiar with the story of someone coming here. And it's funny because across all these different cultures, like from Russia to India to Africa to all the Asian countries that people can imagine, people would always say the same thing, which is like, why do you guys keep fighting and arguing about the same stupid topics? Like, we understand a lot of things about you, but this one thing just doesn't make sense to us. Like you make fun of your own culture. Like you say you're bad people and you talk about like hegemony and things, but it's like very awkward and weird.
Yeah, I think the challenge is that if you can't community is about protection. That's why it exists. I mean, that's its role in evolutionary biology. So if we have a society where the individual thinks that if I have enough W-2 income, I don't need a human to protect me. I could just buy protection, essentially, from the bureaucratic, the mafia bureaucracy can offer me protection. I get all my food, my utilities, everything. I can go live in an apartment myself, buy a dog, pet the dog. I don't need people. This is a viable lifestyle in this country, but you take away all of those third-party bureaucracies, there's a good chunk of Americans actually wouldn't know how to survive if they were asked to. I mean, part of me, I'm sitting here thinking about the hurricane carnage in North Carolina, and not all those people in rural North Carolina are some tight-knit family. Some of them are. Some of them are up there alone.
Yeah, it's weird. This whole conversation is tapping on like 5 conversations I've been having in the last week with a bunch of close friends and family. So it's interesting because I feel like some of this is percolating into the consciousness of people, but not in the media would forbid this conversation. They would pull the plug. They would go to commercial, like whatever it takes.
Well, you just predicted the future of my book PR.
Well said. Yeah.
Which is fine because it can still sell. But I mean,
yeah.
My book is like it's like the random foreign person's initial cultural critique. Like they would be able to write much of that book after 1 year of living here, because it would be fresh. The insights would be fresh to them, and they would see it all. I think that the challenge is that we can create community. We have to learn how to create community without external pressure. This is the challenge of the modern world, right? Because we don't actually need people to survive. We actually need bureaucracies and systems. So if we're going to create actual human community, it has to, I'd say, be much more intentional, which means you have to actually turn your TV off X number of hours a week and get on the phone, meet people. Nothing in our society is encouraging you to do this. So we just have to fight it.
No, unless you show up with a camera phone and film it and post it, then it's encouraging you.
Yeah, exactly. So we have to, I think the answer is it's work. It becomes work. And I was just talking with someone else on another show about how friendship, maintaining friends is work. And that wasn't true. Historically, these would have been people that were they were local, they're down the street, they're on the same street, and you're bumping into them all the time. Like, meeting them wasn't the problem. The question was, how much would you help them, not whether you would or whether you would meet them. But we have to really work at it, or you will literally just you'll be friends with your remote control.
Wow.
And there's actually millions of older people who live like that. Their friend is their television and their pet.
Yeah. Well, I would like to end on an upbeat note, but that's not going to be possible today. Yeah, you were an ideal guest, and I'm not just saying that. If you go back ever and listen to a couple of episodes, you will see that I am basically trying to have this conversation with everyone, and not in a forceful way, in a open way to try to see how much each of us are or are not tracking with this very subject. If you're an intelligent, well-intending person and you want to hear more of these kind of conversations, James writes an incredible blog on Substack, Homo Imaginari, so please support him. Thank you again, James, for coming on the show. To everyone listening, as always, the best way to support the show is to head over to mikeyop.com, that's MIKEYOPP.com, and sign up for the once a week free essay that I write. My name is Mike Oppenheim, and this is another episode of Coffin Talk, and we will see you soon.